What if you could help others to find the power to heal themselves? Physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
When I started teaching my classes, it was in 2002, and I was just doing the past life regressions and contacting the subconscious part. But then as the time went on and we found how powerful this was and what we could do with it, a lot of the students began saying, you know, advanced past life regression doesn't really tell what it's all about. This is so much more than that. We think you should change the name. So it was a few years ago we decided to change the name to Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique. And this is the healing technique that we've now been teaching it, well, since 2002, that's 12 years.
What if you could time travel with them? Visit mythical places or angelic realms, other worlds, other galaxies. Help others to speak to their higher selves. You can. Dolores has taught thousands of people from across the world how to use QHHT, and now you can learn her method by going directly to dolorescannon.com. And don't forget to mention the discount code MORETALKS.
Established over 100 years ago, Watkins Books is one of the world's oldest and leading independent bookshops specializing in esoterica. We have the widest selection of esoteric books in the UK, and our friendly and knowledgeable staff are here to assist you in a unique ambience of our shop. So come and visit us in the heart of London as we're open every day.
The More Show is supported by Mindscape, Paranormal and UFO Matrix magazines, available for download on all major digital platforms.
Show. And here's your host, Kevin Moore.
Welcome back to the show. We're about to be joined by our guest, Charles Pellegrino. Well, just a bit of background on Charles. He's the author of 18 books, including Unearthing Atlantis and Titanic, the Untold Story. He is also the scientist whose dinosaur cloning recipe inspired the Jurassic Park series. Charles has also made dives to the Titanic and to the strange oasis of the deep ocean hydrothermal vents aboard the Mir submersibles. Charles, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Now, just tell me a bit about your work.
Well, with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki project, it was something that actually began in the 1970s with my first encounters with survivors of the atomic bombs. I had a friend who's in high school whose father was in the FBI. We stayed friends throughout college, and he knew that I was both interested and horrified with the rate that the Cold War was going on, with both sides building more and more and more nuclear weapons. In fact, I'd have to say somewhere inside that might have even been a reason for my saying, you know, it might not be a bad idea to go down to New Zealand to study for my PhD, where I have family, relatives that live down there, and I might even want to stay there the rest of my life. But it was he who first began to introducing me to some of the survivors, including that one physician whose eyesight he was giving a speech in New York City, and whose eyesight was actually corrected by the overpressure from the bomb.
Okay, now, the book itself, because I checked Amazon in the UK today, and it's been taken off Amazon. Now, there is a reason for this, isn't there?
The book has come out, I mean, the book came out from the start with bad luck. First, there was the big fight between my publisher and Amazon itself over their electronic Kindle edition, which, with one of the problems that developed with the book, and there too my publisher and I had a disagreement, because I wanted to get a corrected copy out almost immediately, and technology does have the solution. So as long as Amazon Kindle have gone forth and made their system about as pirate-proof, their electronic readers pirate-proof as they can, we can get a corrected edition of this book out within a month.
Okay.
And but even from the start, we had the buy buttons that were closed on the book for almost the first month of the book's existence. Then it turned out Bill Broad of the New York Times gave me a call one day in late February, and he was someone I really trust. I had sailed with him on one of the Titanic expeditions. I knew how he worked. We got to know each other out there, and I knew he was a very thorough researcher. And he called me and he said that one of the people in my book, despite all sorts of documentation that I had seen, including a letter from President Truman that was displayed at this man's funeral. Of course, he had participated in a lot of the firebombings and everything else, and evidently he was practicing for the team that was supposed to be involved in the atomic bombings, and he had evidently gone one mission too far. He had placed himself on one of the planes, on the escort plane, the scientific photographic plane, Necessary Evil, in the seat of a man named John Corliss. And it turns out that there are two. When Bill Broad called me, he said, we have the navigator on that flight. We have another man who was near the tail section of the plane. They're both alive, and two first-hand eyewitness participants in that mission do trump all physical, all the physical letters and photographs and everything else that he had.
Yeah.
So when it was Bill Broad who called me, I knew almost immediately, and I just went very quickly in my mind through, all the photographs that Fuco had had and everything of him standing under the nose art of one of the planes that's disputed, plane called Bad Penny. Clearly photographs of him on Tinian Island, and he's the same man who a year later is in his wedding photograph, that despite all of that he was not on that particular mission. And so I said to Bill immediately, I said, that trumps it, and this is a bit of history that has to be corrected as fast as possible.
Okay, Charles, what actually led up to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks?
Well, the atomic bombs, they had been developing for a couple of years now, and the U.S. assumed that it was in a race with Germany for developing the atomic bomb. When our people got into Germany, it was a matter of when we looked at the silly reactors they had designed and the silly atomic bomb design they had, one of the messages that went back to Washington was talking about the bomb as mother, saying, mother not even pregnant. So the Germans weren't even close. Fortunately, whatever uranium the Germans were able to separate out with uranium-235 and refine it to higher and higher purities, they were not very friendly in terms of sharing their uranium with the Japanese, because the difference between the German atomic bomb design and the Japanese atomic bomb design is that the Japanese bomb would have worked.
So you're saying there, Charles, that the design would have worked, but they weren't quite there yet with the bomb?
Their design would have worked, but the Japanese didn't have any of the material to put into the bomb.
Okay.
They estimated that with all of their resources working for about 50 years, that's about how long it would take them to actually refine enough material to make one uranium bomb. And what they didn't count on was that the Americans were working more than 10 times as fast to separate uranium, and we were also producing plutonium in uranium reactors. But what the Japanese did not know is after we tested one plutonium bomb in the desert, and after we dropped a uranium bomb over Hiroshima, and then we dropped a plutonium bomb over Nagasaki, actually the town next door, Orakami, we were out of atomic bombs for at least the next month.
But why did they choose to launch a nuclear strike against Hiroshima and Nagasaki? What was so special about these two cities?
Well, the cities that were chosen mainly for the manufacturing, mainly for also Hiroshima was a major military base with a huge military presence, a lot of soldiers there. Kokora was another primary target. That one was the one that Charles Sweeney, who flew the Nagasaki mission, really wanted to hit. He was horrified at how large the civilian population was in central Nagasaki as opposed to the military factories that were just upriver of Nagasaki. And Sweeney did something very unusual on August 9, 1945, when a town was burning near Kokora from more conventional fire bombings the night before. The smoke was blowing right over Kokora. They passed over the target, and they could not see. They were under orders not to drop the bomb. With the new imaging radar, you had to see your target before you dropped it. And he passed through flak the first time. This was a very well-defended site. He came back around, this time beginning to really run low on fuel, went through flak a second time. And using a bomb, by the way, that it had these two triggers up front, that if the plane had really gotten hit hard, the bomb could have blown off in the plane itself. He then went around and did something that Paul Tibbets, who had been flying the Enola Gay, said was absolutely crazy. He made a third run at Kokora, this time through closer flak and finally with fighters coming up. He went out of his way to try to hit a target that he had seen as purely a military target. In fact, when he was told he was going to have to fly one of these missions again, the first thing he did was go across to another end of the base. He had to see a priest.
Okay.
And then, unable to hit Kokora, he finally went to Nagasaki, where he dropped that bomb he dropped it way upriver, took out all of the military sites, and what Nagasaki Central itself received, because the bomb was dropped over a valley, was more or less a shotgun effect that went through only part of the city and did manage to spare much of the civilian population of Nagasaki, which he actually got yelled at for doing that, too.
I mean, didn't the US fly B-29s over the people living in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they never dropped a single bomb? What was the reason for this?
Well, the reason that they never dropped a bomb over the targets that were chosen for the atomic bombing was that the targets would be fairly pristine. You didn't want to, in a scientific study by the bombing survey that would come afterward, you did not want a city that already had craters and flattened buildings through it. So they chose these places months in advance, did the fire bombings almost everywhere else. I mean, by that time, almost, I think, between 53 and 57 cities, including one whole section of Tokyo, had been massively firebombed. And these targets were left intact, and they were also trying to coax these cities, the ones that would be the atomic targets, into a kind of complacency, getting them used to only one or two reconnaissance planes, maybe three, flying together over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And actually what they were doing was doing reconnaissance filming for the before and after photography, but also lulling the military into a sense of false complacency.
Yeah, I mean, Charles, how does the number of people killed in a normal bombing, for example, in Tokyo, compare to the number of people killed in the, Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings?
Well, in one whole section of Tokyo in a single night, 200,000 people died. And as one of the people who was involved in the fire bombings had said later, there was a peculiar mathematics between that and the men who were up in the planes that dropped the fire bombs. He had said that during the fire bombings, we knew that there were, in some cases, over 300 other planes flying with us, and that you could convince yourself that your plane hit the gas tanks that you were assigned to aim at, and you're part of the wing. And there was a way of saying when you heard 200,000 people were killed the night before that perhaps you weren't really that responsible. that you didn't hit that many civilians. And as he said about the atomic bombings, where you had Hiroshima, for example, you had the lead plane and the two scientific planes, that all of those souls came back to just a very few men in very few planes, even though you heard that 70,000 people were killed as opposed to 200,000 people being killed in a single day or a night, that the mathematics were much more disturbing. Harold Clayton Urey, one of the scientists who worked out how to separate the uranium, he had felt at first that what he was doing would be the end of war. He said, when humanity sees what science has done, they will see immediately that here is the end of war. And he thought afterward that the atomic bomb had made war much less impersonal, that and therefore much more attractive, and that an atomic war might occur because you just drop a bomb from a plane and the city is gone and you don't see what's happening to any of the people, when actually from some of the men who were in those planes, the message appears to have been quite the opposite, that the atomic bomb was much more personal than a firebombing.
But the bomb was barely ready to use. I mean, tell me about the scientists that died, while adjusting the bomb.
Now, that story, that's one of the problems that we have to correct. There are a few things that have been said over the years. Many scientists have said that there was a problem with the little boy bomb being compromised. Even the 509th, they say, well, the yield of that bomb was 12.5 kilotons. Some estimates are down closer to about 10 kilotons when it was supposed to be at least 22 kilotons. But I think if there was any problem with that bomb, it might have been more in the design than anything else. There were several problems with the bomb. It was a design that was never, ever used again. But the story of the accident, in connecting the dots between certain things that Charles Sweeney had said, certain things that Harold Urey had said about maybe half the amount of uranium that they had expected to go into fission and convert to energy, was all that happened, down to maybe a third. But the connecting of those dots came from a man named Joe Fuco, who said he was there when this accident occurred, and that story, whether or not it's true, if we're dealing with someone who put himself in the seat of another man on one of the escort planes, and we know now that he was not in that seat, one of the changes in the book is that we have to completely disregard that story until or unless other evidence comes in.
But when you refer to the bomb over Hiroshima, you refer to it as a dud, though. I mean, are we saying that the bomb was only partially detonated, or the effect was only partially what the bomb could have produced?
It was the yield was 1/2 to 1/3 of what its design yield was, for whatever reason. And there are a number of engineers, people have said its yield was a disappointment. It's even by several people been occasionally called a dud. And yet the real lesson is, look at the horror that something that went off with only between 10 and 12.5 kilotons was able to do, as opposed to the Nagasaki bomb, which most people have, the second of anything tends to get forgotten. You want to be remembered, you have to be the first.
Yeah.
And the Nagasaki bomb was 3 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Well, up to 3 times more powerful, at least twice as powerful. And yet what most people remember are the pictures of Hiroshima. And look what something that many people considered a disappointment was able to do. And we're talking about a bomb that had about half the yield of what we worry about with Iran and North Korea producing these days.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you imagine the effect of the bomb which went off in Nagasaki, which had the full yield. I suppose you imagine that going off in London or New York. I mean, the effects would be devastating, wouldn't they?
Right, and imagine even worse if it is the sort of bomb that's detonated in a truck or a car at ground level. The radiation effects would be far, far worse. You're talking about a massive explosion, and on top of that, something that matches and that really matches and might even exceed Chernobyl.
Yeah. Even though, again, the design of the bomb was never used again, this shotgun design, was it?
Right. The design where you shoot these uranium-235 rings and compress them into a pin of uranium, a cone of uranium, it was never used again. There were a lot of problems with that bomb.
Yeah.
It was designed that was a little bit twitchy, and it could even go off when you didn't want it to explode. The main technology that had to go into that bomb was making sure that it didn't surge or explode when you did not want it to, which was why that bomb was armed in flight on the way to Hiroshima, rather than on Tinian Island itself. They didn't want the thing blowing up inside the plane and taking the whole island with it.
Now, when the bomb dropped, there was the story of the town clock that had stopped a few days earlier. What do you know about this story?
Right, there was a woman who survived in a bank very near to the hypocenter. She was in this very well-protected, steel-reinforced concrete building with granite, so she was able to survive not very far from the Hiroshima dome inside what we call a shock cocoon, she and one of her friends. And they had been joking that morning about the futility of everything and about this clock in the town that had stopped at 8:15, and there were no men who could be relieved from military duty, any engineers who could fix the clock, and so the clock seemed stuck forever at that time. The interesting thing is that had anyone fixed the clock or not, it would still have stopped at 8:15 in the morning, like every other clock in Hiroshima once the Hiroshima bomb detonated. And in fact, throughout the city, there were numerous clocks and even watches that people were wearing that were found just stopped at 8:15.
Okay. And you just mentioned there the words shock cocoon. What do you mean by that?
Shock cocoons, they occur around all major explosive events. And in fact, had there not been a problem with gamma radiation and a neutron spray going in through windows of buildings, the 2 or 3 people who survived in buildings almost directly under the atomic bomb would have lived probably without any ill effects. And shock cocoon, it's a place where, as near as we can tell, and we don't quite know how they form, we know that some of them form when something, a piece of metal or something is pointed in just the right direction toward the explosion, and the forces diverge around that point, almost in the way that a ship would be, the prow of a ship would be cutting through water, or the nose of a jet through supersonic air. And if you're behind that place where the forces are diverging, then you're relatively safe, where anyone to either side of you might be essentially disintegrated by those forces. And that's what happened in Hiroshima. It's a reason that you see trees near the Hiroshima dome that were still pointing straight up and somewhat intact, and the telephones were intact, and the dome itself was standing right there in the middle of it.
You know, what was it like, Charles, when the actual bomb went off? I mean, what would it have been like directly underneath the bomb?
Well, for about, as far as the compressed air coming down at you, bellying down in this large hemisphere of compressed air, the forces, if you had something that was diverging the forces, it only had to work for about 1/200th of a second, and then the forces would continue down. And the other thing that happened, if you imagine a hemisphere or the lower edge of a dome of compressed air hitting the ground, then it's going to, in the center, bounce upward, and you're going to have, as it spreads outward, a precursor wave or a compression wave that moves out laterally along the ground, plowing everything around it outward. similar example, and one of the Japanese scientists had actually recognized that, boy, how much Hiroshima, which was where the bomb went off, was over a flat plain and a river plain, and how much it resembled the pictures they had seen of Tunguska, Siberia, where you had probably a meteorite of charcoal-like carbonaceous chondrite composition that hit the atmosphere, detonated high above the ground, and everything was plowed outward for miles and miles around, and yet the trees in the center were still standing upright.
Okay. And another thing in your book is you describe black rain. But just for the listeners, what is black rain?
The black rain is a lot of irradiated material, most of it right under the bomb, that was hauled up into the sky, into the mushroom cloud, and also where for about the next 30 seconds you still had some dissipation from radiation effect going on, and actually even further irradiating the material that was being drawn up into the cloud. And once it started to condense, drawing up also a lot of vaporized water from every leaf on every tree and bush that was under the bomb, the black radioactive soot started condensing with the moisture in the upper atmosphere and came down as black hail and black rain. And this was very highly radioactive material. And one of the effects of the bomb itself is if you were within about 1.4 miles of the bomb, a couple of kilometers, you received enough of a dose of radiation that your insides felt, you began to develop an almost unquenchable thirst. And plus your skin was usually badly flash burned. Imagine a severe sunburn, which increases your thirst. And as the black rain came down, people started collecting it in cans that were lying around or in their hands and actually drinking the black rain to quench this thirst. And one of the bad things about radioactive material is it tends to concentrate in biological systems.
We need to take a break there, so stay tuned and we'll be right back.
You're listening to The Moore Show. And here's your host, Kevin Moore.
Welcome back to the show. I'm currently joined here with my guest, Charles Pellegrino. Charles, welcome back. Now, we were just discussing before the break there the idea of the black rain. And I was going to ask you, not everyone that drank the black rain died of the high isotope level that you would expect to find in the water.
Right. One of the women that we were just talking about in the bank who wrote about the clock that had stopped at 8:15, she was still alive as of at least last year. And yet her friend died, and they both drank the black rain. The thing is, we're not robots. We don't all fall at once or in the same way. So an amount of radiation that might kill me, you might survive.
Yeah, exactly. It's
and we don't really understand why.
No, we don't. No, but I mean, at this time when the bomb had been, they set the bomb off. I mean, the Japanese High Command, they didn't feel it was possible that this bomb existed, and they still didn't surrender straight away, did they?
Well, they sent in scientists to confirm very quickly that, yes, this was an atomic bomb. And one of them tried to say around August 7th, the day after Hiroshima, take our word for it, there is no defense against this kind of power. The firebombings are destroying us all on their own, and now if among the firebombings we have these nuclear weapons coming in at us, we've had it. And August 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped, and the emperor agreed with his foreign minister and with a couple of other people that he should record a record to surrender, and the foreign minister put word that, what are the conditions of surrender now? And the U.S. in turn had a moratorium that said, okay, for 4 days we won't do any bombings. We'll just drop leaflets for the people, warning them to surrender. So whereas there had been fire bombings every night on all the way up through the atomic bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th, we had this moratorium that went on until August 14th. What the people in the U.S. did not know is that there was a divide within the imperial palace. There was actually a coup taking place in which the emperor for a while was even held prisoner. He was considered, even by the more fanatical warlords, still sacred, so they couldn't kill him, but they did kill some of his supporters. And then on the night of August 14th, almost anything that could fly was sent into Japan. Over 3,000 planes, closer to 3,500 planes, firebombing everything that was still standing that they could find. And it was finally that, plus the approach of the American fleet, that Japanese spotter planes were deliberately allowed to see and report back about, that finally brought about the end of the divide, the end of this stalemate, and then the supporters of the emperor took over, and his broadcast was put out there on August 15th that Japan was surrendering.
Yeah. I mean, when the bomb went off as well, I mean, would shadows be imprinted on the walls? And if so, would this kind of death be quick and painless?
There were shadows everywhere in both cities. Any place where there was a wall still standing and there had been something, either a bush or a tree or a clothesline, even a dog or a person, there would be a shadow on the wall. That's how, by multiple triangulations, they were able to figure out exactly where the center of the detonation had been, where the light came from. In the case of Hiroshima, only if you were very close to the bomb and caught outdoors was death and vaporization instantaneous. The horror of it is that up to about 1.2 miles away, you could still be exposed to the flash from the bomb and be badly burned on one whole side of your body, leaving a shadow across the Masasa Bridge. And as we know, one woman who was on that bridge who left a shadow on the bridge, along with the people who were traveling with her, she survived for up to 6 days. There was a boy who was at a little closer than the Masasa Bridge, who was in his aunt's garden, and he survived for up to 6 days. He was partly protected by the plants in the garden, and he had burns over what turned out to be only about 30% of his body. And he had the shadows of the plants on his body, and he happened to have been wearing a hat at the time, so his face was protected. And the nurses who brought him to a rescue center thought that this boy would live, but he was also within a range where the radiation was, just the prompt effects of the radiation were enough to be lethal in his case. Yeah. He should have survived from the burns, but it was the radiation that eventually killed him.
Now, when the bomb went off as well, obviously, you know, people had different eyewitness accounts of different events. But, I mean, tell me about the tornadoes of fire, or as some people refer to, the grass boys.
Oh, there were, from the blast itself, Mr. Yamaguchi, who's another person, the only person we know of who survived the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki blast within the fringe of Ground Zero, which is an area where for 85% or more of the people who are exposed unprotected, they die and most buildings are flattened. He had seen where he survived the first bombing. He thought at first he was seeing grass growing out of the backs of these boys, and it was actually grass that was uplifted by the lateral blast and almost like darts blown into the skin of people.
There was another term used as well, wasn't there? The ant people.
Right. Most of these terms are actually terms that come from people who were children at the time and how they described what they saw. So there were the ant walkers or the ant people, and these were people who would file one behind the other like ants There's a doctor who survived and kept a diary, Dr. Haichia. He was actually among these people that were observed, walking in shock for about an hour or two, and that you just lost a sense of yourself and you would follow wherever the person in front of you was following. And they said that people saw this, and it was extraordinary that these people would be walking over rubble and debris and climbing and following one after another, where only a few steps away was a level road and sidewalk that were free of debris that they could have been walking on.
Yeah.
And it was the ant walkers. It went on for several days. The worst of them, who were very badly injured, eventually one of the nurses, Nancy Cantwell, she observed them after about 3 days, and Dr. Fuji took her back into the rescue center, said, "We must go back inside." She saw them basically bleeding water from exposed muscle, and she just had to watch to convince herself, to her own satisfaction, that these last of the ant walkers were no longer aware of themselves, did not seem to be in any pain. And then she went back to treating the people, the burn victims that were within the rescue station.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you mentioned at the beginning of the show, where you said about the blast that also caused some people to sort of have a corrective eye surgery.
Yes, there were two cases that I know of that. There was a soldier who was in a supply cellar, so he was underground, but the blast wave still struck him, and he also discovered that his glasses, through all of it, had remained on his face, and when he got outside and he couldn't see, he found that when he removed his glasses, he could see more clearly. And the one doctor who had the same sort of thing happen to him, he had said to me, this is back about 1973-74, in one of the most amazing cases of understatement I've ever heard. He said, "But of course, I would not recommend nuclear detonations for corrective eye surgery."
Yeah, I mean, we've talked there about the injuries sustained to the human population, but what about the animals? What about people's pets? I mean, what sort of injuries did they sustain?
Well, Dr. Haichia spoke of a horse that had survived, and they kept the horse in his potato garden in the hospital until finally the horse died. The horse had been very badly burned and injured and had suffered actual degloving injuries. Degloving is a very kind of polite way of putting what happens when the blast hits and the skin is pulled off like a glove, almost like the scene in the movie Terminator 2 where Arnold Schwarzenegger pulls the skin off of his hand at one point in the film. And that happened to people, it happened to animals, it happened to Dr. Haichia's horse, which they tended to until finally it did die, and then it became a source of food for the people in the hospital.
Yeah, I mean, what happens to the human body when it's actually exposed to high levels of radiation?
Many things. It depends on whether you're exposed to prompt radiation, which both things happen. The radiation that radiates from the bomb itself during those first few seconds. And a lot of the radiation passes right through you. The gamma rays, for example, like X-rays, they'll pass right through you, but your body will intercept some of them, and that's when you have trouble. They'll scramble and break chromosomes. Then, of course, there's the secondary radiation, the material that comes down in the black rain, the radioactive dust that you inhale or that ends up in your skin or in your body, and continues to radiate for days, sometimes even months, some of the particles even for years afterward.
Now, your book is based, obviously called The Last Train from Hiroshima. Where was this last train going?
It's the people on the last train, actually two trains that went from Hiroshima to Nagasaki. At the heart of the book are the people who incredibly survived both bombings, some of whom knew that Hiroshima had been left pristine, probably for a reason, probably for a testing of whatever this new heat ray bomb was that had destroyed Hiroshima. Two of them were engineers, and they figured this out, and all they wanted to do was get home to their families in Nagasaki, which they knew was another city that had been left pristine, and they said, if I am to die in one of these bombs, I am to die with my family. And two of them actually survived both bombings with their families. In fact, one of them, Mr. Yamaguchi, his wife survived because he came to Nagasaki injured, and she took care of him, and her schedule had been changed that day, and she ended up in a later part of the day than she normally would have been, arriving at her work detail at the new tunnels that were being built by Mitsubishi. So she and the infant child that she kept with her both survived because her husband had been injured in Hiroshima.
Right. Now, did you meet Mr. Yamaguchi?
Yes.
Okay.
Met him twice. In fact, the last time was December 22nd, 2009.
Okay.
He called me and James Cameron to his bed and had us kind of make a promise to him that we would, as he put it at one point, we would become the flame. He would pass on the torch, and we would become the flame together to wake people from this amnesia that we've had since the Cold War ended about what nuclear weapons really do, and help people to remember so that there would not be another city, hopefully, ever knowing a hypocenter. And also that we would carry on his idea, which was something that several of the survivors came forth with what in America we call the pay it forward principle, and that through acts of human kindness, while our government leaders are doing what they can to hopefully prevent nuclear weapons from being detonated again, that perhaps by random acts of human kindness rippling outward and outward, that you might, without ever knowing it, someone whose life you touch might end up touching the life of a child who's growing up in a very bad situation, thinks there's nothing good in humanity, and yet he might be put on a different path just by this pay-it-forward principle reaching him. Now, it's probably a very low probability hope, but I would rather work for that than to just sit back and do nothing and depend only on our leaders. And it's an amazing idea because it empowers even children.
Yeah. It's kind of like a modern father of the world, maybe.
Yeah. And it's a scary thing where in America, especially during the last 9 years or so, I hear people all the time saying, oh, nuke this one, nuke that one, and people have forgotten what the term nuke them really means.
That's right. Absolutely no idea the absolute destructive power of the modern-day weapons as well. I mean, if you compare the modern-day nuclear weapon to the ones used on Nagasaki, the power's just incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, most of the tactical nuclear weapons that we are talking about around the world today, they're actually about the power of the Nagasaki bomb. But also a sub-theme between the title of the book is that, if we don't all try to do something, then we are all on that last train from Hiroshima now. And that's the worry.
What's your take on suitcase nukes?
Well, actually, the Russian suitcase nuclear weapons, they're mostly, they're really more or less an urban legend. They're much larger than suitcases, and plus the Russian bombs, their electronics are designed to deteriorate every 3 months. The Russian bombs have to be rebuilt every 3 months, and that is part of their whole fail-safe. And we have similar systems with our bombs, especially when it involves things like polonium and such, that its half-life is such. The bomb has to basically be rebuilt and recharged every 3 months.
What's your take as well that Japan had already surrendered, yet the Americans still launched the bomb?
Well, actually, Japan had not yet surrendered. And there was a 4-day moratorium between the Nagasaki bomb and the massive firebombings of the country on the night of August 14th. It was really the massive firebombings that broke, finally, the stalemate that was going on in the palace, because there was a period there we didn't know about it, but that the emperor was basically held powerless. The atomic bombs themselves, what most people seem to think is that Japan was sitting out there with its cities intact and green, and that suddenly there were these 2 atomic bombs, and it wasn't that at all. For months before the 2 atomic bombs, there were fire bombings all over the country. And what our military considered it at that time is that the atomic bombs were just 2 more things that were in the toolbox. And it wasn't until afterward, when they saw that these were things that were in their own way even more horrifying in their effects than the fire bombings that had killed 200,000 people in Tokyo in a single night, that the radiation effects were far, far greater than what even the scientists who designed the bombs at the time had thought that would happen. No one had expected, for example, that it would all come right down very near to the explosion center as the Black Rain, for example.
Yeah. I mean, is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are they still is there still relatively low radioactive pockets present there?
Well, actually, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the radiation levels there are very, very low, almost undetectable. But the reason of this is that you had a typhoon sweep through, and you had tremendous rains throughout the whole southern part of the country in September of 1945, and almost all of the radiation was washed out into the rivers, buried under the mud, washed off the land and out to sea. And that's why the residual radiation wasn't quite as bad for as long as it would have normally been if, for example, you detonated the Nagasaki bomb over, for example, Las Vegas, or over California during a very dry season. The Nagasaki bomb, at up to almost 30 kilotons, not many people know this, the destruction could have been much worse if it had been detonated over a very dry area with a lot of dry vegetation, because 80 kilometers away or 50 miles away, trees on mountainsides facing the Nagasaki bomb the leaves were flash desiccated on one side. What this means is if you detonated it over at high altitude at 600 meters over California during a dry season, you would probably have created a hurricane of fire 100 miles across, possibly with a hypercane in the center reaching all the way up into the stratosphere. And that's from something that we regard today as a Model T bomb.
Yeah, I mean, you just couldn't imagine it, could you, really? But that's what it's capable of, yeah. I mean, with regarding the survivors of these bombs, I mean, we must be losing the survivors to history now. I mean, is there many left?
There are several thousand adults that you can still reach and interview about the atomic bombs and their survival. The frightening statistic is in fact, almost all of the people who were children who still had growing bones and bodies at the time of the bombing and who were exposed to the radiation, almost all of them are gone. And so it had a cascade effect on growing bodies, whereas if you had chromosomal dislocations and your cells are rapidly multiplying, that's going to ripple down line into whether the cells are in your growing kidneys or your liver or your skin.
Yeah, no.
And so the cancer rates in children were very, very high, especially bone marrow cancers.
Now, we're coming to the end here, Charles, but I just wanted to ask you about James Cameron's next project. But you've probably been asked this question a few times, but has he not cited your book as a potential next project for one of his movies?
Yes, he has, as one of the sources for a film that he's been kind of... You see, we both have the same two obsessions. One is, will our civilization survive? So he's been thinking about doing a film on one way or another of telling the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for a couple of decades. And the bridge between the two cities is, of course, the double survivors, the people who survived both atomic bombings. So our one big question is, that we've both carried with us in almost all of our works is, do we know how to survive as a civilization? Are we going to stay alive? And then the second question, which he addresses in Avatar, is if we survive to get out there and do the wonderful things that we have the potential to do and eventually bridge the stars, are there trolls lying under that bridge that we have to watch out for? And are those trolls under the bridge ahead really us?
Well put. What's your website, Charles, for people to get in contact with yourself or just to see your work?
CharlesPellegrino.com, and then there's a discussion group attached to the website, and people can go on the discussion group and contact me through that too.
Well, look, Charles, I just want to thank you very much for coming on today, and we look forward to welcoming you back on when we have phone-in lines.
Thank you.
To find out more on Charles Pellegrino, go to www.charlespellegrino.com. Well, from myself and my guest, until next time, thanks for listening.